Family dinners were supposed to be a time of connection, but in my son's house, they had become a stage for my daughter-in-law, Sarah. I am Donna Graham, 65 years old. And I don't ask for much, just a little respect. That evening, the dining room smelled of expensive roast and polished hardwood, a lifestyle they loved to display. I walked in, holding a fresh apple pie. David, my son, barely looked up from his phone. Sarah was busy adjusting a crystal vase. At the family dinner, I was about to sit down when my daughter-in-law pushed my chair away and sneered. "I don't sit with poor, useless people." Silence hung in the room. David shifted uncomfortably but kept his mouth shut. Sarah crossed her arms, a smug smile playing on her lips, waiting for me to break down, cry, or beg for my spot at the table. She thought I was completely dependent on their goodwill just because I was an aging widow. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I placed the pie on the edge of the table. I stood up calmly and said, "You just made a very expensive mistake." Sarah rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. I turned around and walked out the front door. The cool evening air hit my face, and instead of feeling rejected, I felt a sharp, sudden clarity. For 3 years, I had quietly subsidized their perfect life. I paid the bulk of their mortgage directly from my account, covered their property taxes, and let Sarah use a credit card in my name for emergencies. I got into my old sedan and started the engine. I didn't speed away. I drove the speed limit, my hands steady on the wheel. As I pulled into my modest driveway, I knew exactly what I had to do. The time for quietly helping was over. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my kitchen island, and opened my laptop. I didn't feel angry. I felt efficient. I logged into my banking portal. First, I found the joint credit card account. Sarah's so-called emergencies had recently included a designer handbag and a spa weekend. With 3 clicks, I locked the card permanently. Next was the big one. Every month on the 15th, an automatic transfer went from my checking account to their mortgage lender. It was a generous arrangement we made when David's business had a slow year. That slow year was 3 years ago. But the payments never stopped. I navigated to the scheduled transfers page and hit cancel. A small pop-up asked if I was sure. I smiled, clicked yes, and watched the screen confirm the deletion. I spent the next hour untangling my finances from theirs. I removed David as an authorized user on my savings account and changed all my banking passwords. I wasn't being malicious. I was simply re-establishing the natural order of things. If I was too poor and useless to sit at Sarah's table, my money was clearly too useless to pay for the roof over it. I closed the laptop and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, untethered from the constant anxiety of their overspending. The next morning at 9:00 a.m., my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was David. I let it ring. 2 minutes later, a text popped up from Sarah. "Hey, Donna. The card isn't working at the grocery store. Did the bank block it?" I took a sip of my black coffee, set the mug down, and typed my reply. "The card isn't blocked. The account is closed," I texted back, then placed the phone face down. Within seconds, it began to ring wildly. Sarah, then David, then Sarah again. I ignored them, put on my gardening gloves, and went out to the backyard to prune my rose bushes. The morning sun felt warm, and the repetitive clipping was therapeutic. I refused to let their panic dictate my day. Around noon, I finally answered David's call. He sounded breathless. "Mom, what is going on?" Sarah was embarrassed at the checkout line. Her card got declined in front of everyone. It's not her card, David, I replied, snipping a dead leaf. It's my card, and I've decided I no longer want to pay for her groceries or her spa trips. But we need that card for essentials, he pleaded, reverting to the helpless tone he always used when things got tough. You are a 32-year-old man, I pointed out. You both work. You'll figure it out. Sarah snatched the phone from him. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Listen here, Donna. You can't just cut us off without warning. We have a lifestyle to maintain. Turn it back on right now. You told me last night you don't associate with poor, useless people, I reminded her mildly. I'm just respecting your boundaries. Sarah, have a good afternoon. I hung up the phone and turned on the Do Not Disturb feature. I knew Sarah well enough to know she wouldn't let this go. She was used to controlling the narrative and bullying people into submission. If phone calls didn't work, she would escalate. I looked toward my front door and realized my old brass locks hadn't been changed since my husband passed away. David still had a spare key. I walked back inside and called Tom, a local handyman who had done repairs for me over the years. By 2:00 p.m., Tom was packing up his tools, leaving me with 3 shiny new keys and a heavy-duty deadbolt on the front and back doors. Thanks, Tom. Just wanting a bit more security these days, I told him, handing over the cash. Smart move, Donna. He nodded. Less than an hour later, a silver SUV aggressively pulled into my driveway. Sarah stepped out, her face flushed with indignation. She marched up the porch steps, not even bothering to knock, and jammed her key into my door. I watched through the peephole as she jiggled it, her frustration mounting when it wouldn't turn. She yanked the key out and finally pounded on the door. I opened it slowly, leaving the chain engaged. Why doesn't my key work? Did you change the locks? She demanded, glaring at me through the narrow gap. This is my home, Sarah. You don't live here, so you don't need a key, I answered evenly. You are being ridiculous. David is your son. We have a right to access this house, she snapped, crossing her arms. Nobody has a right to my property but me, I corrected her. I reached down, picked up a cardboard box I had packed earlier, and unlatched the chain to hand it to her. These are some coats and boots David left in my hall closet. I won't be storing them anymore. She stared at the box, bewildered. You're cutting us off over a joke at dinner? You'll never see us again if you keep this up. That is entirely your choice. I smiled politely, stepping back. Drive safely. Sarah, I shut the solid oak door in her face, locking the new deadbolt with a satisfying click. A month rolled by in absolute peace. I took up a watercolor class and started reading novels I hadn't touched in years. I didn't reach out to David, and true to Sarah's threat, they didn't contact me. I knew the silence was a tactic, a way to punish me until I crawled back, begging for their company. They were in for a long wait. The quiet broke on the 3rd of the new month. I was on my porch, enjoying a glass of iced tea, when David's car parked on the street. He walked up the path alone, looking uncharacteristically rumpled. His shoulders slumped, and he lacked his usual defensive posture. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. Mom. Hello, David. I nodded to the wicker chair opposite me. Have a seat. He sat heavily, rubbing his face. The bank called this morning. The mortgage payment bounced. They said the auto draft was canceled. It was, I confirmed, taking a sip of tea. I canceled it weeks ago. Mom, you know we rely on that, he whined, looking at me with wide, expectant eyes. Sarah has her heart set on that new kitchen remodel. If we have to pay the mortgage ourselves, We won't have the cash for the contractors. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table between us. It was a simple breakdown of their combined income versus their basic bills. You make plenty to cover your own mortgage, David. The math is right here. The problem isn't a lack of money, it's a lack of discipline. He glanced at the paper, his face flushing. Sarah already hired the crew. They start tomorrow. She thought your payment was coming. I leaned forward, looking my son directly in the eyes. Then you better go home and tell her to cancel them. David left, looking physically sick, but I felt no guilt. The responsibility was his, not mine. The next morning, I was at the grocery store picking up fresh produce when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus, the owner of a local contracting business. I had recommended him to David a year ago for a minor roof repair. "Hi, Donna," Marcus began, sounding a bit awkward. "I'm over at David and Sarah's place. We're supposed to start demo on the kitchen today, but Sarah told me to send the invoice directly to you for the deposit. I just wanted to verify before we start swinging hammers." I paused by the tomatoes, admiring their color. "I'm glad you called. Marcus, I am not funding this remodel. Do not send me any invoices, and I advise you to secure payment directly from them before you do any work." "Understood. Thanks for the heads up. Donna, I figured it was best to check." I hung up, feeling a mild sense of pity for Marcus, but immense relief that I wasn't footing a $50,000 bill for marble countertops. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood gossip network informed me of exactly what happened. My friend Martha, who lived 2 doors down from David, called me laughing. She had been watering her lawn and watched the whole spectacle. "Donna, it was something else," Martha chuckled. "Marcus and his crew spent 10 minutes talking to Sarah on the porch. Sarah was turning red, waving her arms around. Next thing I know, the crew is loading their tools right back into the truck. Sarah looked absolutely furious. She assumed I would pay blindly, I told Martha. Well, she assumed wrong. Martha agreed. "I think they're heading your way," by the look of how she peeled out of the driveway. I thanked Martha and went to put the kettle on. By the time the tea was steeped, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, aggressive buzz. I opened the door, keeping the screen locked. Sarah and David stood there, Sarah vibrating with rage. "You humiliated me," Sarah yelled through the mesh. "You told Marcus you wouldn't pay." I simply answered his question truthfully. I replied, pouring tea into my cup. "I'm not paying." "You promised," Sarah insisted. "I never promised you a kitchen," I corrected her. "You assumed my wallet was always open. It closed the night you decided I wasn't fit to sit at your table." "Mom, please," David interjected, trying to play peacemaker. "Can't you just help us out this one last time? The old cabinets are outdated." I set my teacup down, walked to the hallway table, and picked up a manila envelope. I unlocked the screen door, stepped out, and handed it to David. He opened it, pulling out a spreadsheet. "That is a ledger of every mortgage payment, credit card bill, and expense I have covered for you over the last 3 years," I explained calmly. "It totals over $80,000. That was my retirement savings, supplementing your luxury." Sarah snatched the paper, her eyes scanning the columns. Her face paled slightly, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Families help each other, Donna. That's what mothers do. Mothers help," I agreed. "They don't act as ATMs for people who despise them. And speaking of property," I looked over at the driveway, where they had parked their second car, a practically new sedan. The insurance and registration for that car renew next week. David blinked, confused. Yeah, what about it? I offered a tight, polite smile. It's entirely in my name, and I'm not renewing it. You wouldn't dare, Sarah scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. That's my car. I drive it to work. It is my car, I corrected her smoothly. I bought it. My name is on the title. And I pay the insurance. You merely drive it. I'll need it back by Friday. Sarah dragged David away, loudly declaring I was bluffing and that I would fold by the weekend. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Arguing is what people do when they lack the power to act. Thursday night arrived. I hadn't heard a word from either of them, nor had they returned the vehicle. I didn't call to remind them. At 10:00 p.m., I put on a light jacket, dropped my spare key fob into my pocket, and called a rideshare. The driver dropped me off a block from their house. The neighborhood was silent, street lamps casting long shadows. I walked casually up their driveway. The car sat there, doors locked. I didn't need a tow truck, a repo man, or a dramatic confrontation. I simply pressed the unlock button on my fob, opened the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life. I backed out quietly and drove away, leaving an empty space on their concrete pad. I parked the car inside my own closed garage, locked the door, and went to bed. I didn't lose a minute of sleep. At 7:30 the next morning, my phone lit up with a text from David. Mom, Sarah's car was stolen. We're calling the police. I typed back immediately. Not stolen. I picked up my property, as I told you I would. The title is in my name. Do not waste their time. A long, heavy silence followed. I smiled and went to make breakfast. 2 weeks passed. The reality of their financial situation crashed down on them like a collapsed roof. Without my monthly injection of cash, and with only one car between them, the facade of their perfect life shattered. Late one Tuesday afternoon, David knocked on my door. I let him in. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes standing out starkly. I led him to the kitchen and silently placed a ham and cheese sandwich and a glass of water in front of him. He ate it like he hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Things are bad. Mom, he finally mumbled, staring at the empty plate. Sarah is furious about taking the bus. We're behind on the credit cards because we had to pay the mortgage. We fought all night. I'm sorry to hear that. David, I said, wiping down the counter. Can you just float us a small loan just to get ahead of the interest? He looked up, a familiar pleading in his eyes. I stopped wiping and looked at him. No. Mom, please. We're drowning. You are drowning because you chose to jump in the deep end with weights tied to your ankles. I told him, keeping my voice gentle but firm. I love you, David. But I will no longer fund your wife's disrespect, nor will I protect you from the consequences of your own choices. You have to learn to manage your own life. He dropped his head into his hands. I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him sit with the discomfort. For years, I had robbed him of the opportunity to be a capable adult by always providing a safety net. It was time he felt the hard ground. When he left, he didn't slam the door. He just walked away, finally understanding that the Bank of Mom was permanently closed. 6 months later, my life looked entirely different. With the extra money staying in my own accounts, I had refreshed my living room, planted a new vegetable garden, and booked a week-long cruise to Alaska for the fall. David and Sarah had to put their house on the market. They couldn't afford the mortgage and the lifestyle they craved on their own. They downsized to a modest apartment closer to Sarah's job. Sarah still didn't speak to me, which suited me perfectly. David started coming by once a month. He would bring coffee, and we would sit on the porch. He looked tired, but for the first time in his adult life, he looked grounded. He was finally learning the value of $1 and the heavy cost of trying to impress people who didn't matter. During one of his visits, he looked at my new porch furniture. "Place looks good, Mom." "It feels good," I replied honestly. We didn't have a tearful reconciliation. There were no dramatic apologies or sweeping declarations of changed behavior. We simply existed with new rules. He knew where my boundaries were, and he knew they were made of concrete. I realized that stepping away from that dining room table was the best thing I had ever done. I hadn't just saved my retirement, I had reclaimed my dignity. I was no longer an unwanted guest in a house I was paying for. I was the master of my own home. As I watched the evening sun dip below the horizon, I felt a profound sense of peace. I didn't need their approval, their table, or their fake smiles. I had my self-respect. And that was the most valuable asset I could ever own. Respect is never a gift given away blindly. It is a boundary enforced by action. When people mistake your kindness for weakness and your generosity for an obligation, the most powerful thing you can do is quietly walk away. You don't need to argue, yell, or break down to prove your worth. You just need to stop funding the lives of those who don't value your presence. True peace begins the moment you realize that your dignity is worth far more than any relationship built on convenience. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that it's never too late to reclaim your peace, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next story.